Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good morning. It is my honor to welcome you at the 27th Annual Forum 2000 Conference. In 1997, President Václav Havel and Nobel Peace Prize laureate Elie Wiesel brought to Prague for the first time a broad array of thinkers, politicians, activists, and religious leaders to meet in the framework of the Forum 2000 Conference. Since then, Forum 2000 is held every year to contemplate the major challenges facing democracy and human rights. When Forum 2000 participants first met in Prague, there was a lot of anxiety, but there was also plenty of hope. We mostly still believed that despite many problems and imperfections, democracy was in a steady rise, and it will eventually prevail, leading to a world where individual freedom, peace, and shared prosperity would be the norm. Today, the situation is different. There is still plenty of hope, no doubt about it, but the level of anxiety has grown significantly. And for good reason. Democracy is under attack. This is a phrase that has become so frequent in recent years that we almost stop paying attention to it. Unfortunately, it is true. And it is being confirmed, underscored, and emphasized by new developments every day. From the Russian aggression against Ukraine to the rise of populist politics in established democracies, from the increasingly aggressive China, Iran, or North Korea to the horrible atrocities committed by Hamas in Israel. The threats to the future of democracy are worryingly clear. Authoritarian regimes are actively undermining the rules-based global order, establishing new authoritarian alliances, formal or informal. Our own cherished democratic instruments, free elections, and freedom of expression are falling prey to non-democratic actors. How should we, the global democratic community, deal with these challenges? How can we protect the rules? How can we protect the rules-based order, which, and we have to admit that, is not perfect and needs reform, but which at least partly protects the small and weak and establishes basic rules of the game? How can we, democracies and democrats, take back the initiative? These and other questions are on the agenda of this year's Forum 2000, and it is important that we seriously consider how to answer them. Time is getting short. I would now like to thank all our partners, without whom this gathering would not be possible. In particular, the National Endowment for Democracy, the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the International Visegrad Fund, the Bosch Foundation, and numerous other partners and program partners that have made this conference rich and interesting, as it hopefully will be. On behalf of all of those who have worked hard to make this gathering possible, allow me to welcome you at the 2023 Forum 2000 conference. We look forward to inspiring and productive discussions. As I said, in organizing this conference, we have worked closely with our friends and colleagues at the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It is therefore my privilege to invite to the podium someone who so wonderfully builds upon the best of the legacy of Václav Havel's foreign policy, applying it to modern and efficient diplomatic practice. Please welcome Mr. Jan Lipavský, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic.
Dear Madam President, dear Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends. It is my pleasure and privilege to have the opportunity to speak at the official opening on the 27th Forum 2000 conference. We are proud that today we are also opening the second edition of the Forum for Ukraine that has been organized in cooperation between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Forum 2000 Foundation. This is the second time that the shadows of Russian aggression against Ukraine hangs over the Forum 2000 conference. Only a couple of days ago, we were all horrified by the gruesome images of Hamas terrorists killing and kidnapping hundreds of Israeli civilians, including women and children, in communities around Gaza. This is reality. This is our world. Today, we are in the hall that carries the name of the late President Václav Havel, one of the founders of the Forum 2000 Foundation. Let me therefore quote one sentence from his speech titled "Europe as a Task." That, by the way, became the motto of our last year's presidency of the Council of the EU. In his speech in Aachen in 1996, he said, and I quote, "One of the great European traditions is the idea of the free citizen as the source of all power." In this idea of the free citizen that Nazism, communism, and other totalitarian regimes fought hard to destroy during the 20th century. Our country has an unfortunate experience with these efforts of the enemies of human freedom. Nowadays, this very same idea is under attack from the current Russian regime and his allies, as well as from terrorist groups around the globe. The brutal attack on Ukraine is part of Russia's much larger fight against liberal democracy, freedom, and human rights. It reminds us that the fight for freedom, for democracy, for human rights never ends. It never ends because the enemies of freedom will always sought to destroy, to rule, to conquer the others. They are blinded by their lust for power. To face them, we need to be consistent in our quest for freedom. We shall be persistent in upholding the power of the citizen. To succeed, we need political will. The government I'm part of takes the protection of human rights and democracy seriously. Czech foreign policy is once again based on Havel's tradition of active, responsible, and humanistic politics. Our policy is grounded in our historical experience, and it's based on value principles. We need to uphold these principles even in the face of evil. We know from our own bitter experience where appeasement leads. It is, therefore, in the Czech vital nation interest to live in a world governed by agreed rules and international law, and not by the law of the jungle. We do not want a world in which the great powers arbitrarily determine where the sphere of influence begins and where it ends. To succeed collectively as a democratic world, we also need a vibrant civil society. This is why conferences like the Forum 2000 are the essential part of this struggle. They provide a platform to discuss, to think, and to argue. So let me thank you for keeping on organizing Forum 2000, for bringing people together, and for offering us politicians useful observation for our future actions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Minister Lipavský. As most of you are aware, it has been a long time since we had a president of the Czech Republic speaking at Forum 2000 conference. I'm therefore very pleased that this period has ended. It is my enormous honor to welcome the President of the Czech Republic, His Excellency Petr Pavel.
Well, thank you for the generous introduction. Dear President Sandu, Minister Lipavský, distinguished guests, and all of the friends of democracy. I'm honored to have the opportunity to address this well-renowned conference. Forum 2000 has always played a unique role in the public debate, not only as a legacy of Václav Havel, as mentioned, one of the founding fathers, but also as a crucial platform for raising our voices and speaking out in defense of universal human rights around the world. In the early years, the goal was to bring together the world's thinkers and leaders to identify the complex challenges facing humanity at the turn of the millennium. The list of speakers who had the privilege of attending the forum is still impressive today. The forum has brought key debates on the value of democracy, even at a time when our own politicians sometimes downplayed the visibility or even the importance of human rights and democracy, a long-standing pillar of the Czech foreign policy. Fortunately, Czechia has always been built on a strong and engaged civil society. A civil society committed to the responsibility for supporting human rights and human rights activists, free media, and independent journalists, and prisoners of conscience around the world. Just as other countries supported our own struggle for democracy under communism after its fall in Czechoslovakia in 1989, we soon realized that it was and still is our time to help others. By working closely with many domestic and international NGOs, we have shared our own unique experience of transformation from a totalitarian to a democratic society. It was never a straightforward path, and we certainly made some mistakes. But we have learned our lessons, and that, I believe, makes us credible. Looking out to the audience, I see many brave people who do not hesitate to stand up for their rights and the rights of others, granted by international law, but denied to them by their own governments. You are the ones who understand and define the true cost of freedom. It is your personal courage and sacrifice that remind us of how precious and fragile the concept of democracy is. The enemies of freedom might argue that spreading the ideal of democracy is actually an attempt to decide the fate and future of other countries, and thus the undesired interference into their domestic developments. But this has never been the case, because in democracy, this power is reserved exclusively to the people. However, it is our moral obligation to do everything we can to help create the best possible conditions for good and inclusive governance. This year marks the 30th anniversary of founding of my country, the Czech Republic. It may seem like a long time ago, but our own current experience with disinformation and other forms of hybrid warfare shows that democracy is vulnerable and under permanent pressure and can never be taken for granted. Over the last decades, Czechia has focused its effort on development and transformation of cooperation in countries which have gone through a similar process as we did in the 90s. However, more and more, the need to defend democracy is growing also within our own democratic societies. Critical debate and fact-based decision-making are constantly disrupted by narratives based on lies, rapid spread of disinformation, and incitement of hatred. This is extremely dangerous. Not only do they undermine the cohesion of our societies based on mutual respect, trust, and the rule of law, but in the long term, they also undermine our security and prosperity. Yet the current challenges in defending democracy should not have come as a surprise. Václav Havel foretold this predicament when he spoke of the natural disadvantage of democracy, which ties the hands of those who wish it well and opens up unlimited possibilities for those who do not take it seriously. To untie our hands, we need to improve engagement with our citizens, rebuild trust, invest into better education. And I am convinced that our goal is not a mission impossible. History has proven that the longing for freedom is stronger than desire for oppression. Our fundamental rights and freedoms have always been the cornerstone of our prosperity and security. We need to have a substantial discussion on how to preserve our freedom of speech and open society while strengthening the resilience of our democracies, in particular with the growing influence of technologies on our perceptions of reality. We also need to make it absolutely clear that freedom of speech goes hand in hand with responsibility and can never be taken as carte blanche. Looking at the program of this conference, I am very pleased that these are exactly the topics that will be addressed this year. Throughout my career, I have learned that you can achieve much more if you cooperate with others. I believe this applies not only to people, but also to the governments. The end of globalization as we know it requires that we do not isolate ourselves and to put even more emphasis on working with all our partners around the globe. Promoting an alliance of democratic societies will lead to a more proactive and cooperative approach in areas of our strategic interest. New challenges, such as climate change and cyber threat, requires increased effort and capabilities. At the UN General Assembly, I had an opportunity to listen to and to speak with a number of world leaders and learn firsthand about the complex realities of other countries that are currently facing. My own lesson learned is that we must keep telling our story to other people. And at the same time, we have to carefully listen and to try to understand their own stories. Sharing our unique experience is the best way how to explain our views and policies without patronizing. It is also the best way not to allow anyone to rewrite, erase, or alter our history. Like many of you, I truly believe in the universal concept of freedom, human rights, and democracy. Our strategic competitors are working hard to undermine these values. Unity, dialogue, and cooperation is what make us stronger and resilient against any kind of threat. Our values are the same values that Ukraine is fighting for right now, and I hope that President Zelensky will soon return to this forum in person as president of a free, sovereign, and whole Ukraine. Terror is unacceptable, be it in Ukraine or in the Middle East, and needs to be resolutely confronted. Hatred and violence have never led to lasting peace and prosperity, and we must ensure they will never prevail in our world. Ladies and gentlemen, preserving democracy is our common responsibility. Its future is in our hands. Together, we should strive to ensure that next year we will meet under more positive circumstances. I wish you a very productive, thought-provoking debate. And I promise that as a president, I will do everything in my power not to let democracy down. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, for those wonderful and inspiring words. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to introduce our other keynote speaker of this morning. She's not new to the Forum 2000 conference. We had the pleasure of welcoming her first as opposition leader, facing a very dire situation in a country torn by oligarchs and malign meddling from Putin's Russia. Later, in 2019, she spoke at this conference again as Prime Minister, after forming a complicated coalition and planning, despite the enormous obstacles, important reforms to put her country on the European path. Today, when the country is finally and fully on this path to the EU membership, it is my enormous honor to welcome her again, Her Excellency Maia Sandu, President of Moldova.
Thank you. President Pavel, Minister Lipavský, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to speak in front of this distinguished audience. It's an honor to be here with you to think together about the present and the future of democracy. Last time I participated in this forum was in 2019 as Moldova's Prime Minister. This was soon after we got rid of a corrupt authoritarian regime which wanted to turn Moldova into a gray zone of lawlessness. I'm here today with two messages. First, democracy and individual freedom remain the guiding light at the end of the geopolitical tunnel for our societies. Second, in their longing for freedom, these societies deserve your full support. In hindsight, when I was there last time, a new Iron Curtain was already casting its ugly shadow over our European home. But we were still hoping at that time. We hoped that the Cold War had ended peacefully, that the Soviet Union and its territorial expansion had been confined to history books as objects of study for inquisitive free minds. We expected that our nations would continue to choose their destiny without constraint from Russia. We hoped that Russia would shed its totalitarian past and look inward to define its worth through economic, technological, and scientific progress, not through capture of land and wanton killings of civilians on the territories of its neighbors. In short, we hoped for a peaceful transition to democracy and well-being for all in our home, Europe. We are in a different world now. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine upended the region and rendered worthless tacit and written agreements, pledges, guarantees. Russia's war is designed to end Ukraine's existence as a sovereign state and of the Ukrainian people as a nation. If Russia had succeeded, it would have probably ended Moldova's existence as a free state too. Today, Russia wants to control former Soviet Union states as it once controlled Central and Eastern European states. Pretexts, ideology, and historical circumstances change. The essence of brute force remains. It is a mistake to believe that any nation in the region can sit it out on the sidelines. The extent of geopolitical upheaval is such that most nations will have to make choices which will define their futures for decades to come. As before, the question is on which side of the curtain do we want to be? On the side of democracy, freedom, pluralism, or on the side of oppression, disregard for human life, and reckless propaganda? Your countries have seen both. Czechia and Slovakia, Romania, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria were all once held captive against the will of their people on the dark totalitarian side of the Iron Curtain. You know better than anyone what this means. It's difficult to explain it to people who didn't experience it. The Soviets planted and maintained their rule in Central and Eastern Europe through killings, disappearances, torture, and the imposition of pervasive fear. Even the thought of resistance, of democracy and free will had to become impossible. Your nations understand better than anyone how my own country, Moldova, has been held captive for so long. Now your nations are on the bright side, on the side of democracy and individual liberties, on the side of peace and security. They broke free to rejoin their European family. The shift didn't happen automatically. It happened through sacrifice, through the desire to live free and to choose freely. The shift to the bright side was forged through the Prague Spring and the sacrifices of the dark August days of 1968. The entire world pays homage to the courage of your people who cherished their desire for freedom, for belonging to their European home through decades of oppression. In his captive mind, Czesław Miłosz explained how East European intellectuals were forced to accept the realities of repressive regimes. But repressions could not eradicate their inner national core and their disloyalty to the regime. Those who did not give up, those who did not submit, those who fought and ultimately broke free from mental captivity to make the liberation of the late 80s and early 90s possible. It is now our turn to follow the light at the end of the tunnel, to take a safe refuge in the EU and consolidate our democracy. Democracy for us is a choice, both civilizational and existential, to break free, to preserve ourselves, our way of life, set our own path, determine our own destiny, or remain in the past. For too long, the Moldovan people have been denied a voice, denied their national dignity, denied a future. For too long, we, the Moldovans, have not been allowed to be ourselves. But free nations do not sacrifice their dignity, not even to a far superior force. Moldova did not either. We have preserved and we are reaffirming proudly the dignity and self-worth of our people. The unjust and unprovoked war to subjugate Ukraine leaves no doubt. If we fail, we will be dragged back into Russia's sphere of influence, into the past, open to invasion at any moment. Just like the Prague Spring and the Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia, Solidarity in Poland, Moldova's generation of intellectuals, writers and poets from the 90s laid the ground for our national revival movement, which resonates in our hearts and has charted our way forward through the difficult transition process. Their vision, courage, and sacrifice ensured that Russia will not succeed in replanting the Russian world in Moldova today. We live in our Moldovan world. It is small, it needs care, but it is ours, and it is European. We were once torn away from Europe, and we are now restoring our true European identity, just as you did. The road is fraught with risks. We are on the front lines, as Russia's hybrid war is gaining steam to undermine the legitimately elected Moldovan government and wreak chaos to keep the country captive. But I have no doubt that we will succeed. Why? Because democracy is essential for Moldova. The desire to be free, to live in dignity, and decide on our own the destiny comes from within, from the Moldovan people themselves. It is not invented, not imposed. This is our people's genuine choice. The nations of Central and Eastern Europe that have come through long decades of repressive regimes understand and support us in our quest for freedom. I'm certain you will not abandon us as you once felt you were. We know you will do everything within your power to help us chart our course towards the European Union, to welcome us into the free world, into your world. Thank you for your constant and unwavering support to my country.
Thank you, Madam President, for that powerful speech. And yes, I have also no doubt that you will succeed, and we will always stand by you, by Moldova. Now, it is my pleasure to invite the moderator of the first panel, Melissa Chen, and her colleagues, President Sandu, President Pavel, Ms. Joan Chirwa, and Mr. Damon Wilson, to the floor.
Madam President, Mr. President, Damon, very nice to sit down with you. Joan. The plenary session is entitled Democracies Standing Together Vis-à-vis Mounting Challenges. Welcome to you all. Now, before we begin, I actually want to address events that have happened in the Middle East over the past 10 days, and I want to give participants a chance to comment on this at the end of our discussion. Of course, if you, in the course of this discussion, feel like it's relevant to mention, by all means do, certainly don't avoid it. I actually considered whether I should start with asking a question, but we can easily get bogged down in an entire conversation about geopolitics in the Middle East, so I won't. So with that out of the way, I did want to address it. I want to actually start with the very title of this discussion and challenge it. Democracies Standing Together. Does that make sense? And by that I mean, as an American, I look at US President Joe Biden's Democracy Summit. And the invite list was a bit of a struggle, quite controversial. Turkey was invited. And according to Freedom House's index, it is considered not free. India, according to Freedom House, and also Professor Larry, sorry, I'm just blanking on his name.
Diamond.
Larry Diamond. I was going to say Larry David. Very different American. He mentioned this as well. India is considered partly free. And of course, as an American, I have looked over the past 20 years at my country's close alliance with Saudi Arabia, a theocratic authoritarian state. So when we talk about democracies standing together, is it a paradigm that works? I'll start with the political leaders. Madam President.
In our case, it works because the democratic countries did support Moldova when we were in a very difficult situation at home, fighting a government which was becoming authoritarian, a corrupt government, and the support of our external partners of the democratic world helped us to overcome the situation and encouraged us to continue to fight for democracy. And then, of course, the democratic world helped a lot once the Russian war in Ukraine started, and then Moldova had to face a lot of challenges. And I just want to say that it would have been impossible for us to resist, to overcome these challenges, if it was not for the support of the democratic world. So we do believe that democracy should stand together, and we do count on the support of the democratic world in the future.
Mr. President.
I'm arguing for the big global alliance of all democratic countries, wherever they are, regardless if they are gathered in the EU or NATO or any other format. But at the same time, we cannot digitize real life. It's not about 0 or 1. We will probably never find an ideal democratic country. We're all converging to the ideal of democracy. So we may lead endless discussions about a number of countries and their level of democratic status. But we should probably come to a common denominator that is defined by the respect to the rules, that is defined by preferring dialogue and consultation over confrontation, and invite all these countries to a table to discuss future arrangements. We face now the discussion about a rules-based international order that is being challenged by a number of actors, China, Russia, and many others. There is a good argument to have that discussion, but we have to approach it from the position of all equals, not the might is right.
So you talk about the need for establishing a common denominator. That's very different than a democracy summit like the US president arranged. Would you then, what I'm hearing is the suggestion that that actually is not necessarily a useful paradigm, what the American president established. Because a common denominator is not about democracy, it's about rules-based order. An authoritarian state can abide by the rules-based order if it so wishes.
I'm probably now affected by the impact of General Assembly of the UN, where I heard a number of views from the countries in Latin America, Africa, Asia, that have a number of justified questions about current world order. I think it's fair to lead a very open discussion, but we shouldn't restrict the invitation to the table to those that we deem as democratic. We should probably invite all those willing to discuss and having a frank and open discussion. And that's another format. I think all those countries who are preferring discussion over confrontation should be our partners.
Damon, over to you. Same question, your thoughts.
Melissa, before I take that on, let me just first say, Jakub, if you think about what's in this room, the legacy that has been built towards President Havel, the extraordinary people around this room, it is a really powerful living legacy to Havel, and congratulations for that, because that's part of the answer that I'm going to get to. But also the legacy of Havel was leaders in their intellectual, civic, political life getting into the arena and seeing President Sandu, seeing President Pavel, principled, values-based leaders reclaiming the initiative. These are the building blocks we need. Now, Melissa, you asked the framework of Summit of Democracy, Democracies Together. First of all, we do need to recognize that it's actually pretty natural when democracies, if you look at American history, that we're often slow to recognize the challenges in front of us. We're slower than to act on them, and even slower to begin acting together. And this is what we're in the middle of. And so I tend to think of it a couple of ways. We do need democracies to be mobilized, working in together to rally behind the support for the Ukrainian people, for Moldova's European aspirations, to stand by Taiwan's democracy. We need them to work together to think about how to develop means to protect their own open societies, investment screening, and other things that we have just been naive about in the circumstances of today. But I prefer to think of this, rather than democracies versus autocracies, as democrats versus autocrats. When you open up that mindset, your agency we end up having billions of allies on our side as democrats around the world, small d democrats, standing against the few autocrats that hold power. That is the mindset, I think, of how can we understand that the energy and some of the answers are going to come from the vanguard of small d democrats around the world, increasingly working together where we have a responsibility to understand how to accelerate that democratic learning, how to have this sense of solidarity that's being fostered here at Forum 2000, and more importantly, then how to put that into action in a counter-mobilization against autocrats at the third level, which I would say is really standing by those in the most repressive places who are challenging the autocrats on their home turf because they understand the built-in vulnerabilities of those systems, whether it's our Burmese friends, our Tibetan friends, our Zimbabwean friends that are with us, to give them oxygen in this moment, understanding that that's a sense of solidarity for Democrats because they can fundamentally help transform this. If you bring it back, Melissa, it means that democracies haven't fully understood that support for small d Democrats around the world, support for those on the ground in the most repressive societies, is actually among the most effective national security strategies for democracies. And we need our political leaders from Japan, Korea, with those in Europe, across the world, to operationalize that of how we can begin to work in common cause. So I'd open up the aperture a bit, Melissa, to get to the right answer.
And I want to follow up a little bit more on that in a minute about civil society in democracies. I'm going to Joan. Same question about the paradigm, but I just wonder about, I often wonder about this as someone who's covered this for 20 years. When countries like the United States or unions like the European Union are talking about democracy standing together, and then what is the discussion happening in the global south, for example, around the democracy summit, around this sort of, whether, as you mentioned, it's state to state, sort of high level, sort of democracies versus authoritarianism. How is it going down in the countries that you're covering?
Thank you, Melissa. If you may allow me to just pick it up from what President Pavel had said earlier with regard to invitations to countries that we all know and see that there isn't any democracy going on. I truly believe in what he said, where we can not only restrict it to the democratic countries, because there's quite a lot that they can actually learn from countries that practice democracy. And I also see it as an opportunity where these countries that have, been claiming to be democratic, but we all know that what goes on does fall far short from what has to happen in a democratic state, can see how beautiful it can be when all the voices come together and begin to speak about how positive democracy is, because we know that that's the most ideal way in which we can see our countries being governed. Because like you all know, democracy is about the people. Without the people, then there can be no democracy. And one thing that they have to realize, actually, which is a positive about democracies, is that they're quite noisy. So democracies will allow people to speak, and they will speak out without having to fear anything. But unfortunately, we see that there are quite a number of countries that will use elections, for instance, as one of the platforms through which they can say we are a democracy, when actually democracy doesn't exist. Because immediately after that, we see quite a number of arrests of people that do want to speak out. And the moment you become critical, then it becomes unsettling to those people that are in power. And they see you as a risk, and they would do whatever it takes to make sure that you don't have that much voice. So some of those experiences that really do go on in these countries that, democratic sometimes and in most instances, democratic by word and not necessarily by practice, can be pushed to ensure that they stick to the word and begin to practice what ought to be practiced. But then coming to the discussions that you were talking about, it's one of those bigger questions, really, and you may wonder what is going on, but I suppose it's one of those things where you extend as much as possible on the table to see how you can discuss and hopefully maybe push forward you know, all the good principles that are being practiced in a democracy, to see that maybe those that don't do that can begin to also pick lessons from there and get to your side and ensure that everybody else lives in a free world. And of course, going by the theme of this conference, where we begin to push and take ourselves to a route of a democratic world order, which everybody else envisions, which we all know is the most ideal world that we all want to live in, because it gives us all the peace and the power and the room and the leverage to practice and fully be free citizens that are able to express ourselves without having to fear anything.
Just to follow up on what Damon said about the small d of civil society, how vibrant is that? What are you seeing? Is it growing, diminishing in the countries you're covering, including Zambia, South Africa?
Yeah. If I look at Southern Africa, for instance, and I will speak from the perspective of me being Southern Africa correspondent for the Committee to Protect Journalists, I do interact almost on a daily basis with journalists in the Southern African region and also civil society players. Let me begin with my own country. Of course, we all know there's been quite some positives coming out with regard to democracy after the previous election. But I'll also take you back to what I had said earlier, that the holding of an election, the holding of a peaceful maybe and free election, cannot be used as a yardstick to measure just how far a government is ready to go on and ensure that people do feel and, confidently speak about how democratic the country can be. While everything else has been going on, we of course have seen a continued arrest of some opposition players for some of the most flimsy reasons that you can ever think about. And all those are actually based on the existing laws that are still haunting us, and most of them have been around for many, many years, from the colonial days, and they're still being used by the government to ensure that there is a suppression of those that would want to speak out and criticize in whatever way possible. And that's been one of the major things. A few things have been done, for instance, the repeal of the defamation of the president law. Right. It's no longer law, effective December last year. But that's just one tiny component of just a number of other restrictive laws that are still existing. We still have the criminal defamation that a number of those that are in power are able to use against the citizens that are known and seen to be extremely critical of the powers that be. We have the cyber laws that are currently undergoing some form of review, but what comes out of that is obviously something for discussion at a much later stage. But overall, while some steps are being taken to ensure that all the democratic institutions that do exist are protected and provide the power that people need, there is also another aspect where the same institutions are actually impeding on the rights that the people have. And what you must know is that our constitution actually guarantees these freedoms, but nobody seems to care much about them, because Article 20 of the Zambian constitution talks about freedom of expression. But in many other aspects, we also have these laws that are existing side by side with what is contained in the Constitution, going against, the freedoms that people have to enjoy. If I may be allowed to move, to our neighboring country, Zimbabwe, which on most occasions is referred to as Zambia's Siamese twin, and, for obvious reasons, because what goes on at times in Zimbabwe is really similar to what goes on in Zambia. That's another area where I will give an example of the holding of the election being misunderstood as something that can be called, or related to democracy. But you see that a number of, for lack of a better term, horrible things did happen prior to the elections and even after. For instance, the clear drive to ensure that there aren't as many people to observe the elections in that country, where several others were thrown out and others were denied accreditation. And some of the local observers, I recall, I think a day before the elections, were arrested for whatever reason. There wasn't any proper reason at all.
So it seems like when we talk about small d Democrats, right, they are under assault in a lot of the in the instances you're talking about. And so I do want to talk about that civil society. I think authoritarian states, semi-authoritarian states, have learned from the lessons of the 20th century. And one thing that one of their takeaways is not to allow civil society to flourish, to allow the small d Democrats to flourish. Damon, that's your bread and butter. You're trying to support civil society around the world. They've got this new strategy. What are your thoughts? How do you fight back?
I think that's an important point. They've got a new strategy. We haven't fully recognized, Larry started to really talk about this last night, to recognize the environment we're in is far more hostile, complex, with sophisticated adversaries that is compounded by the populist backlash in established democracies. And this has created a new environment in which we haven't fully really adapted to act like it, whether democracies as governments or whether democracy support organizations that still sometimes operate as if they're in a benign environment. That hostility is sharp. We see the use of facial recognition technology from Uyghurs to Belarusians and what that means. We see the pressure of democratic diasporas pushing democratic leaders out of your country, whether it's Burma or Nicaragua. And we see this compounded by the rise of a PRC, a China, that's been able to help neuter some of the international institutions, provide a little bit of a protective support for that, all exacerbated because of the populist wobbliness in many established democracies. And so in this environment, we've been seeing on the front lines all of our partners facing extraordinary setbacks, attacks, pushes, and yet in each spot, we see remarkable innovations of how people are beginning to leverage technology for democratic purposes, or how they're being able to think about some of the ways to get around, solve these problems. Ultimately, the openness of a democratic movement is what fuels that ingenuity, that innovation. What we've failed to sort of do, I think, is accelerate that connective, as we have faced the strategy of an autocracy, Inc., as Anne Applebaum calls it, of autocrats working together to protect their wealth, to protect their legitimacy, to fabricate elections and democratic processes. We haven't yet mobilized as a democratic community, connecting the dots across so many people and the organizations in this room, of how we launch a counter-mobilization for democratic purposes, how we regain that initiative. And I think that's the task of what we're doing here at Forum 2000. I think that is the energy you see within civic movements around the world. People are not sitting back taking it. They're coming together, figuring out how to go on offense. And to see a Ukraine's defense that wasn't just from a Ukrainian military, but from an activated population, to underscore the agency of individuals and civic life to really defend that freedom. And I think that's what's at mix right now and play right now. And it's sort of our task to help connect the dots, accelerate that democratic learning, and support those on the forefront of that struggle in a pushback.
Madam President, how do you support civil society in your country at a time when you are facing multi-dimensional assaults, fairly dramatic ones too?
Well, now our objective, of course, is to strengthen the government institutions, the state institutions, so that the state could protect the people. But we are aware that we need to also work on strengthening the civil society, because things can change, and we need to accept that working for democracy is not something that you do over, 10 years and then you relax. It is clear that we'll have to continue our entire life to work and to fight for democracy. This is how things work these days. And I do believe that we need to have the right expectations, not to believe that we do this hard work and then we stop here and everything's going to be fine. So on one hand, our biggest now effort is to strengthen the capacity, the independency of our institutions, so that they could protect people and they could provide the necessary environment, including for the civil society. But we do have the support of the civil society, tremendous support, especially in fighting propaganda and disinformation, which is a very powerful instrument by Russia to undermine our processes, our democratic processes, and to destabilize the country. So here we have a very good cooperation. We are creating now ShatCom. The state is creating it, but we're doing it together with the civil society and with the countries which have been doing this for a while. And I do believe that we need to work together, because even when you talk about the global south, I think there is a lot of disinformation, again, pushed by Russia about its war in Ukraine, and this is becoming a big issue. The free press is extremely important. The free press was very, very important in Moldova when we were fighting a corrupt and authoritarian regime. It continues to be important. We are trying to help it now, but these are elements that we will need to continue to invest and to discover. The technologies, on one hand, can be a very damaging instrument in the hands of the authoritarian regimes. We need to be smarter and to understand how we can use the technologies to protect the democratic processes. These are not easy answers. We're trying to learn from those who are better than us in dealing with these issues. In our case, it's also the dirty money coming from Russia, and this is again about fighting corruption together, because the dirty money which comes from Russia, they don't come straight from Russia to Moldova, they go through other countries. And if we don't have enough openness and interest, including by the countries which have strong anti-corruption institutions and rule of law, if we don't have strong interest on their part to come together and to fight this movement of dirty money, then of course for countries like mine, it becomes much more difficult.
Mr. President, how do you view protecting civil society? Because I think to a certain extent it is a matter of national security as well.
Well, it's interesting how far we moved from this value-based policy introduced by Václav Havel 30 years ago. And speaking for some sentiments in Czechia, many people took all of the democratic benefits as something that they are entitled to, and they took it as a baseline that the state is obliged to give them, and that they don't have to strive for it any longer. It's simply here, and we only have to live better and better and have more and more. Without feeling any sense of responsibility. And I'm not trying to disregard all the positive elements of civil societies, but I have a feeling that we severely underestimated the education towards values over the last 3 decades. That brings us to the situation where we do not see democracy as something that we have to deserve, we have to work for, we have to cultivate, but something that we are simply entitled to. And here I see a lot of efforts to overcome the internal pressures and animosities inserted not mainly from the outside, even though it is a part of hybrid warfare of our competitors or sometimes enemies, but also it is to a large extent our own product that we developed against each other, competing not just among political parties, but among different views, strands. I had discussions with a number of friends from other countries, and it's amazing that the feeling of this animosity and adverse is stronger towards our own nationals than towards our enemies. For example, in the US, when I spoke to my Republican friend, he told me I would rather accommodate Russian than a Democrat. And we have the similarities in my country as well, that people hate each other for their view much more than they hate those who are oppressing others. So we have to put a lot of effort into reminding ourselves the foundations, the values which our societies are built on, reminding how strong civil societies can be if they are well based in values, if they cooperate, if they educate people in the sense of togetherness and defining who is actually our adversary. It's not the progressivist, it's not the conservative within our own societies. It's the influence of countries that are autocratic, that deny human rights, that deny civil liberties. And on those countries, we have to focus our attention not to fighting each other internally, both within one country or within our community of democratic countries.
Now that takes, it sounds like something like democracy literacy, or in the United States, in some schools, what we call civics lessons, which have actually been defunded over the decades. And that goes to the youth. Right? Polls around the world show that young people, Gen Z, millennials, but especially Gen Z, have very little faith in democracy compared to the older generations. So when we talk about supporting democracy and the need to fight for democracy at every generation, there is a need for everyone to address young people. So I want to build on what you said about taking democracy for granted. What are you thinking about? What is your government thinking about? What is your organization thinking about? As a journalist, how are you educating or thinking about addressing young people and trying to explain to them just how important democracy is? For example, I actually don't know, but you know, in Czechia, is there a civics education? Is there any kind of government required, like a class required to learn how the government works, respectively? First of all, Mr. President, since you were talking about this.
Okay, let me start with a couple of concrete examples. One part of the answer is teaching history. In our system, young people end up with the Second World War, or at best the year 1968, and that's it. They do not get anything more from modern history. So how can we expect from them to understand modern history and the place of our country in the context of Europe or the world when we don't give them any foundation for it? So that's one part. The other is education towards citizenship and the values, democratic values. Again, they are getting partially that piece of education, but they are not too much involved in what's going on. And I see the audience, my competitor from the presidential race, Madame Nerudova, who was strongly involved with young people, and actually attracting young people into the process was extremely important, because they wanted to be involved. They were much more informed in a number of areas than the generation of their parents. So now we have a discussion about the age in which people are entitled to go to the elections, to be put down to the age of 16. I think it's a fair proposal, because many people are active, young people are active. They want to be part of the decision making, and they have a number of good ideas. So I think there is still a big debt that we have to pay to a young generation to bring them much more on board, both in terms of education and engagement.
Madam President.
Well, it is true in the case of Moldova that there are many young people who take democracy for granted. And I think with democracy and freedom is like with health. You start to appreciate it only when you lose it. We should do better in terms of education. We do have the civics lessons, but I don't believe that we're doing enough in the schools. So we've been talking about this. It is about education. We have been working very hard to involve young people in politics in general. I mean, I established a political party together with my colleagues, and we had a lot of young people joining us. We do have many very young people as members of the parliament for the first time. We do have 40% of women in the parliament today, thanks to the policies that we promoted in the last several years. We do have many young people as state secretaries or even ministers. We didn't make it easy for them to access government jobs because young people would need to have lots of experience before joining the government. Now we eliminated that. We do need young people who want to learn and who have the energy, to change things in the country. So we've been doing pretty well in terms of attracting young people in the management of the country, but with those people who are not interested in becoming politicians, presidents of the country, and so on, we have to work harder in terms of education. They do see, on one hand, what happens to the young people in Russia when they criticize the president or when they say that they're against the war and that these young people end up in prison. But I think they don't really internalize it, that this can happen to them unless they will step up and involved in this fight for freedom.
Damon, does the National Endowment for Democracy have a specific overall strategy when it comes to looking at young people around the world?
I'd say the next generation is a top priority in the endowment. We often think of this as an intergenerational strategy and that we can build on the legacy of incredible people who paved the way, whether it's Václav Havel, my own predecessor, Karl Gershman, and build that into the next generation where we focus and give oxygen and energy to take forward that struggle and fight. So it permeates across how we think of our work at the endowment. But I'd also say that this is a bug. This is not a bug. This is a feature of democracy. The frustrations, the unsatisfaction of the next generation, thank goodness. That's a good thing. That's what happens in a democracy that's unsatisfied with the status quo, to make the accountability, the drive of self-correcting mechanisms. We've talked about the importance of state institutions, but it also becomes civic life, independent media, social movements of youth that actually sometimes protect those institutions, that change ways, the way we think about things. So if you think about social movements across your countries, in the United States, an anti-war movement, a civil rights movement, these were often very much empowered and led by young generations that didn't often translate into electoral political victories at the moment. Often didn't. And yet, they helped move and shift the entire parameters and thinking of the broader population, the broader public, that actually means that today, if you're an African American in my home state of South Carolina and a member of the LGBT community, a woman, you are more free today than at any point in American history. And yet today, frustration, anger, dissatisfaction, this is a built-in feature of a democratic process. We don't need outside information propaganda wars to tell us the faults that we all have in our own societies. Our people and our next generation hold us to account, and for that, we are stronger. That is how we have self-correcting mechanisms that by definition are blocked and don't exist in autocratic regimes, which ultimately mean our messiness, as you said, Joan, makes us resilient, while the cleanliness of an autocratic regime can mean it is brittle and fragile. And so this energy is one that we have to nurture, support, and welcome the frustrations and energy of the next generation that pushes us out of our comfort zone.
Joan, your work as a journalist, how often are you thinking of your audience and young readers?
Yeah, quite a lot. I will speak on behalf of the organization that I represent first, which is the Free Press Initiative. We have created a network of young journalists from the training institutions themselves to try and assist them in many ways possible in which they can tell stories. But these have to be impactful stories, unlike, the usual that people will find even on social media easily. And what we're also trying to do is to work directly with these media training institutions to see how best they can incorporate as much as possible what really makes a lot of sense right now when it comes to the practice of journalism. For instance, investigative journalism. That's one of the key areas that can only thrive in a democracy. But then we cannot make the journalists to look at it as something lucrative if they do not understand what democracy entails. So it begins from there, where we try and build this capacity, and I'm glad that there's been quite a lot of interest from that perspective, and we're seeing a lot of them coming forward and wanting to be a part of what the Free Press Initiative has been doing. Outside that, we have also been in talks with high school, which we call secondary level education, where we can begin to speak to those that are not yet into tertiary education, so that there can be some sort of enhanced training in civic education, and also work with the educators themselves, because we notice that there's a little bit of a lapse there, where the people that are teaching in most of the schools or some of the schools actually don't understand what they need to understand, because you cannot teach when you yourself is not well informed. So there is that aspect of, the civic education that we're trying to do. And personally, as a journalist, I have been, having a lot of mentorship programs with several journalists, and this is usually done in-house, where I personally visit a number of newsrooms to speak about how good it is, to practice as a journalist in a democracy, because there are quite a lot of things that can be done which can only be possible in a democracy. Now, if that is taken away, then it becomes extremely difficult to do anything. And of course, we see how our colleagues have to risk their lives. We have already lost quite a lot of journalists, not just one or two, but quite a lot all around the world, losing their lives because they are playing their role, which is only to inform and educate the people as journalists. We also do work with community radio stations, which have got the largest network in my country, and these have been having licenses without any difficulties, which is one of the positive things. And these do work directly with the people on the ground. So when you talk about the grassroots, those that need to get this information, they are there in all the corners of Zambia, including the most rural of the areas that you can ever think about. But what they lack is education. And that's where now we do come in to try and assist them. And we've tailored programs which work specifically for them and developed some material which will be extremely helpful. And we were doing that just a few months ago, where we developed some standard operating procedures for each of these radio stations in all the 10 provinces of our country, because we believe it's only through that they will effectively communicate. Because it's one thing to communicate, but doing it effectively is another thing. So we're trying to play that role in bridging the gap that has been existing.
There's a lot of work being done with your organization, training young journalists. It's pretty amazing. We have just a few minutes left. I did say at the start that I would give anyone the opportunity to comment, if you so wish, on the events of the Middle East. I imagine both of you have already been asked many times, but I don't know if, Mr. President?
I think we should approach it not from an emotional point of view. Of course, when we see the pictures presented by the media, you can't avoid emotions. But at the same time, we should stick to the very rational assessment of the situation and see where the whole conflict now evolving in the Middle East can lead us, and who is potentially behind. One thing is to condemn very strongly the barbaric aggression that Hamas carried out against Israel. The other is proportionate response. And we also have to distinguish between punishing Hamas and punishing all the Palestinians. There are many Palestinians living inside Israel proper, many Palestinians living in Western Bank that are not affiliated to Hamas and are even willing to find a constructive solution with Israel. And of course, making it emotional will lead us to the binary view. And we should avoid that binary view at any cost and to exert all the pressure on one hand, on punishing all the perpetrators of these barbaric attacks, and on the other hand, to exert pressure on getting back to the table as soon as possible, with regard to resolve the situation in the Middle East without extending the conflict to other countries.
Thank you. Madam President.
Well, Moldova did condemn the atrocities committed by Hamas in Israel. We have one Moldovan who was killed there. And at the same time, of course, we are concerned with the fate of the civilians caught into this atrocities and this conflict in Gaza. And we have people there whom we're trying to get out. But of course, this is not about our people. This is about the innocent people. It does look that this is not just something committed by Hamas, and it might be larger, and it does look that this is going to increase the challenges of a democratic world. Of course, there are questions now about, what's going to happen to support for Ukraine. And I do believe that we need to all understand that the support for Ukraine needs to continue. It's extremely important to help Ukraine win this war. This is not just about Ukraine and Moldova is safe today thanks to the courage of the Ukrainian soldiers and of the courage of the Ukrainian authorities. This is about the international rules-based system, and it concerns everybody, not just in this region, but around the world. So that's one of the reasons why Ukraine needs to be helped to win this war. But I do believe that things might become more complicated now, and we just need to have the unity.
Damon.
Clearly we all witnessed the horrific atrocities and attacks of Hamas on Israelis, the worst loss of life for the Jewish population since the atrocities of World War II and the Holocaust. And I think as Democrats around the world, understanding that the values that we cherish and support are completely under assault when you revert into conflict. To recognize that, for example, the endowment has had programs supporting Palestinian Democrats, independent journalists, women's associations, Next Generation, that believed in a peaceful, democratic future for the Palestinian people. And we've been doing this since the early 90s, coming through the Oslo process, which has been derailed. And to recognize that we should not conflate Hamas with the Palestinian people. Hamas has hijacked the aspirations of so many Palestinians. And I think that's an important thing to understand, how to distinguish the accountability of terrorists with a nihilistic vision of criminal approaches, with how to be able to support what really needs to take root, are those Palestinians that are arguing for, working for something that it actually is based on the true voice and agency of the Palestinian people, which has either been snuffed out by violence or corruption.
Right.
They merit support in this time. But I also think in a larger context, we have to understand not to take our eye off the ball of what's happening. Hamas's power today is a result of Autocracy, Inc. We've seen a really networked use of globalized structures, whether it's arms, political protection, financial networks, that are empowering, whether they're corrupt dictators in Africa or Latin America, whether it's Hamas, whether it's ammunition supplies to Vladimir Putin's army today. And the challenges that we're facing are testing democracies globally. We have to mount a resolve, a sense of resolve and purpose, that we can rise to these challenges in this moment. And if we don't, we will invite more challenges. We will see a conflict in Taiwan. And yet if we can muster the resolve to stand by those fighting for democratic principles and freedom in a way with clarity today, we can help prevent potentially other autocrats that may be tempted to try to take advantage of what they perceive as our lack of political will, our lack of resolve. So these are testing, trying moments that matter very much for the future of democracy.
Thank you. Joan.
Thank you, Melissa. One thing I will say is what we are seeing is truly what I believe is usually the tactic that the weak try to employ whenever there's a difference. They see violence as the only way to sort out whatever comes up, which to me is something that can only come out of those that are weak, because strong people do not tend to violence. Strong people know how to call each other on the table and say, let us discuss whatever it is that could be troubling between countries or among countries. So whenever you see such things happening where the only thing that you think about is violence, then you definitely, you are able to tell that whoever is behind this does have a weak mind. And this is truly unfortunate, because what we see is extreme aggression and truly emotional and traumatic experiences by the people in those countries where war is going on. And ultimately, I also see a lot of innocent victims. And speaking as a journalist, I see how traumatic this can be on my fellow journalists that have to cover whatever is going on. And unfortunately for some, they even lose their lives. When you talk about Ukraine, we have lost journalists there, which is truly, truly unfortunate. And this is something that must not be allowed to go on. And for me, really, I think the solidarity that we are talking about here has to be turned into real practice than just mere words when we talk about it. And I believe this is something that we can take forward beyond the Forum 2000, whereby we must begin to speak to each other. And when I talk about this, I think it's something that we really have to go in strongly, especially for my region, where we have to find ways in which we can forge our efforts together and begin to call upon whoever it is that is in control of power to ensure that they stick to, what they preach. I know it can be unsettling because nobody is comfortable whenever you speak truth to power, but it's good that we do have leaders, for instance, the two presidents sitting on this panel here and openly speaking, and I know that they are extremely tolerant whenever criticism is raised about how their governments are being run. But that's not the case for a number of places, and most of the people that do suffer ultimately are the people like myself who are journalists, when we are only, distributors of information that we collect, but we do get along, caught up in all the mess that goes on, which is extremely unfortunate. But going forward, I believe there's still hope for democracy, where we can all stand together and speak as one.
That is an excellent last word. Thank you so much, Joan. Damon, thank you so much. Madam President, Mr. President, thank you so much.